nature alone. Haven't we done enough? We're so self-important. So self-important. Everybody's going to save something now. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. What? Are these fucking people kidding me? Save the planet? We don't even know how to take care of ourselves yet. We haven't learned how to care for one another. We're going to save the fucking planet?
Μια ακόμη πρωτοβουλία ευαισθητοποίησης και ενημέρωσης με αφορμή τις κλιματικές αλλαγές και τα προβλήματα που δημιουργούνται στον πλανήτη ανέλαβε ο Δήμος του Βόλου. Ειδικότερα ο Δήμαρχος Αλέκος Βούλγαρης και η Πρόεδρος της Δημοτικής Επιτροπής Παιδείας Κερασία Μπαρτζιόκα εν ώψη της Παγκόσμιας Συνόδου για το Κλίμα στην Κοπεχάγη διοργάνωσαν εκδήλωση με θέμα SOS για τον πλανήτη που πραγματοποιήθηκε σήμερα το πρωί στην αίθουσα εκδηλώσεων του Δημαρχείου με σκοπό να στείλουν οι μαθητές της πόλης ένα ηχηρό μήνυμα για την καταπολέμηση της κλιματικής αλλαγής.
Πρέπει να ενημερώσουμε ξανά πάλι τους συμπολίτες μας ότι η πόλη του Βόλου έχει μια πρωτοτυπία σε αυτή την προσπάθεια, δεδομένου ότι είναι από τις λίγες πόλεις στην Ελλάδα που συμμετέχει σε αυτό το μεγάλο πρόγραμμα της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης που συγχρηματοδοτείται από την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση στο LIFE, που αφορά την μείωση αερίων που συμβάλλουν στο φαινόμενο του θερμοκηπίου.
Για πολλά εκατομμύρια χρόνια υπήρχε μια σταθερή συγκέντρωση διοξιδίου του άνθρακα στην ατμόσφαιρα. Άμα πάμε πιο πίσω στο χρόνο, αυτή η συγκέντρωση του διοξιδίου του άνθρακα άλλαζε δραματικά. Δηλαδή υπήρχαν περίοδοι που ήταν πάρα πολύ αυξημένο, άλλες περίοδοι που ήταν πιο χαμηλό, χαμηλές συγκεντρώσεις. Ξέρουμε ότι το διοξίδιο στην ατμόσφαιρα έχει αρχίσει και αυξάνεται τα τελευταία 100-150 χρόνια λόγω των εκπομπών αερίων, διοξιδίου του άνθρακα και άλλων αερίων από την ανθρώπινη δραστηριότητα.
Να το μελετήσει κανένας και να βγάλει σημαντικά συμπεράσματα για την απόκριση που έχει το φυσικό σύστημα σε αυτή την υπερπροσφορά διοξιδίου που γίνεται από τις δραστηριότητες της ανθρώπινης.
The major premise of the inconvenient truth is that carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas that drives the temperature of the Earth.
They can go back 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
Like Mr. Gore, the United Nations uses this information to prove that Earth's CO2 and temperature are highly correlated. And they are right. However, a high correlation proves nothing. To give an extreme example, there is a 100% correlation that any human that breathes air will die. But that does not prove that breathing air kills people. Far from it. We would all die if we didn't breathe air. But even the correlation used by Mr. Gore in the United Nations is misleading. Notice they kept the two graphs separate. By doing so, the human eye perceives that CO2 causes temperature to rise. However, when the temperature graph is superimposed over the CO2 graph, it becomes apparent that CO2 tends to follow temperature, not precede it, strongly suggesting that the CO2 does not cause the temperature to change, but the temperature causes CO2 to change.
This book was written and produced by the producer of Al Gore's movie. What she did was to switch the captions on the graphs for temperature and CO2 going back 650,000 years so that she could show that it was CO2 that had changed first and temperature that had followed, when the unanimous opinion of the scientific literature, by a very simple series of measurements, shows that it was exactly the other way around. It was temperature that had always changed first and CO2 had followed.
I've learned many things in the last 20 years, and I've learned this. If Al Gore's involved, it's a scam. End of story. Of course they give him the Oscar for his rubbish, ludicrous documentary. Of course he gets the Nobel bloody Peace Prize, because the people that want this thing out there control who gets those things. And we have, oh, you know, if it's a scam, Madonna's singing on the bloody stage as well, it seems to me. This is the great Earth concerts around the world, selling a lie. These people do no research. And here's the global warming survival handbook for those live Earth concerts, written by David de Rothschild.
The whole global warming issue is a farce. Global warming is occurring, don't get me wrong, but it's not caused by man.
Worst reason for the change in the climate, it's not CO2, that's rubbish. Yeah. But of course, to spread rubbish, you get a Nobel Prize, because people believe what mass media is telling you.
So you don't believe in global warming. I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
Each day, the news reports grow more fantastically apocalyptic. Politicians no longer dare to express any doubt about climate change. The global warming story is a cautionary tale of how a media scare became the defining idea of a generation.
The whole global warming business has become like a religion. And people who disagree are called heretics.
In 2005, a House of Lords inquiry was set up to examine the scientific evidence of man-made global warming. A leading figure in that inquiry was Lord Lawson of Blaby, who, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1980s, was the first politician to commit government money to global warming research.
We had a very, very thorough inquiry, took evidence from a whole lot of people expert in this area and produced a report. What surprised me was to discover how weak and uncertain the science was. In fact, there are more and more thoughtful people, some of them a little bit frightened to come out in the open, but who quietly, privately, and some of them publicly, are saying, hang on, wait a minute, this simply doesn't add up.
We are told that the Earth's climate is changing. But the Earth's climate is always changing. In Earth's long history, there have been countless periods when it was much warmer and much cooler than it is today, when much of the world was covered by tropical forests or else vast ice sheets. The climate has always changed, and changed without any help from us humans. We can trace the present warming trend back at least 200 years, to the end of a very cold period in Earth's history. This cold spell is known to climatologists as the Little Ice Age.
Let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. It doesn't show signs of stopping.
In the 14th century, Europe plunged into the Little Ice Age. And where we would look for evidence of this are the old illustrations and prints and pictures of Old Father Thames. Because during the hardest and toughest winters of that Little Ice Age, the Thames would freeze over. And there were wonderful ice fairs held on the Thames, skating and people actually selling things on the ice.
If we look back further in time, before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period. Going back in time further still, before the medieval warm period, we find more warm spells, including a very prolonged period during the Bronze Age, known to geologists as the Holocene Maximum, when temperatures were significantly higher than they are now for more than 3 millennia.
If we go back 8,000 years in the Holocene period, our current interglacial, it was much warmer than it is today. Now the polar bears obviously survived that period. They're with us today. They are very adaptable, and these warm periods in the past, what we call hypsithermals, pose no problem for them.
Climate variation in the past is clearly natural. So why do we think it's any different today? In the current alarm about global warming, the culprit is industrial society. Thanks to modern industry, luxuries once enjoyed exclusively by the rich are now available in abundance to ordinary people. Novel technologies have made life easier and richer. Modern transport and communications have made the world seem less foreign and distant. Industrial progress has changed our lives. But has it also changed the climate? According to the theory of man-made global warming, industrial growth should cause the temperature to rise. But does it?
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
Industrial production in the early decades of the 20th century was still in its infancy, restricted to only a few countries, handicapped by war and economic depression. After the Second World War, things changed. Consumer goods like refrigerators and washing machines and TVs and cars began to be mass-produced for an international market. Historians call this global explosion of industrial activity the post-war economic boom. So how does the industrial story compare with the temperature record? Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over ½ degree Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940, but the temperature actually began to decrease 1940, continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation. When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature decreasing, then we cannot say that CO2 and the temperature go together.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
Just at a time when, after the Second World War, industry was booming, carbon dioxide was increasing, and yet the Earth was getting cooler and starting off scares of a coming ice age. It made absolutely no sense. It still doesn't make sense.
Although CO2 is a greenhouse gas, greenhouse gases themselves only form a small part of the atmosphere. What's more, CO2 is a relatively minor greenhouse gas.
The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases. And of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
So is there any way of checking whether the recent warming was due to an increase in greenhouse gas? There is only one way to tell, and that is to look up in the sky, or a part of the sky known to scientists as the troposphere.
If it's greenhouse warming, you get more warming in the middle of the troposphere, the first 10-12 kilometers of the atmosphere, than you do at the surface. There are good theoretical reasons for that, having to do with how the greenhouse works.
The greenhouse effect works like this. The sun sends its heat down to Earth. If it weren't for greenhouse gases, this solar radiation would bounce back into space, leaving the planet cold and uninhabitable. Greenhouse gas traps the escaping heat in the Earth's troposphere, a few miles above the surface. And it's here, according to the climate models, that the rate of warming should be highest, if it's greenhouse gas that's causing it.
All the models, every one of them, calculates that the warming should be faster as you go up from the surface into the atmosphere. And in fact, the maximum warming over the equator should take place at an altitude of about 10 kilometers.
Leave nature alone. Haven't we done enough? We're so self-important. So self-important. Everybody's going to save something now. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. What? Are these fucking people kidding me? Save the planet? We don't even know how to take care of ourselves yet. We haven't learned how to care for one another. We're going to save the fucking planet?
That you don't see that effect. In fact, it looks like the surface temperatures are warming slightly more than the upper air temperatures. That's a big difference.
That data gives you a handle on the fact that what you're seeing is warming that probably is not due to greenhouse gases.
That is, the observations do not show an increase with altitude. In fact, most observations show a slight decrease in the rate of warming with altitude. So in a sense, you can say that the hypothesis of man-made global warming is falsified by the evidence.
So the recent warming of the Earth happened in the wrong place and at the wrong time. Most of the warming took place in the early part of the 20th century and occurred mostly at the Earth's surface, the very opposite of what should have happened according to the theory of man-made global warming. Former Vice President Al Gore's emotional film, An Inconvenient Truth, is regarded by many as the definitive popular presentation of the theory of man-made global warming. His argument rests on one all-important piece of evidence taken from ice core surveys in which scientists drilled deep into the ice to look back into Earth's climate history hundreds of thousands of years. The first ice core survey took place in Vostok in the Antarctic. What it found, as Al Gore correctly points out, was a clear correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature.
We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clarke is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clarke and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
But how can it be that higher temperatures lead to more CO2 in the atmosphere? To understand this, we must first restate the obvious point that carbon dioxide is a natural gas produced by all living things.
Few things annoy me more than to hear people talking about carbon dioxide as being a pollutant. You're made of carbon dioxide. I'm made of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is how living things grow.
What's more, humans are not the main source of carbon dioxide.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans. Carl Wunsch is Professor of Oceanography at MIT. He was also visiting Professor in Oceanography at Harvard University and University College London, and a Senior Visiting Fellow in Mathematics and Physics at the University of Cambridge. He is the author of 4 major textbooks on oceanography.
The ocean is the major reservoir into which carbon dioxide goes when it comes out of the atmosphere, or from which it is re-emitted to the atmosphere. If you heat the surface of the ocean, it tends to emit carbon dioxide. So similarly, if you cool the ocean surface, the ocean can dissolve more carbon dioxide.
So the warmer the oceans, the more carbon dioxide they produce, and the cooler they are, the more they suck in. But why is there a time lag of hundreds of years between a change in temperature and a change in the amount of carbon dioxide going into or out of the sea? The reason is that oceans are so big and so deep, they take literally hundreds of years to warm up and cool down. This time lag means the oceans have what scientists call a memory of temperature changes.
The ocean has a memory of past events running out as far as 10,000 years. So, for example, if somebody says, oh, I'm seeing changes in the North Atlantic, this must mean that the climate system is changing. It may only mean that something happened in a remote part of the ocean decades or hundreds of years ago, whose effects are now beginning to show up in the North Atlantic.
The current warming began long before people had cars or electric lights. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over ½ degree Celsius. But most of that rise occurred before 1940. Since that time, the temperature has fallen for 4 decades and risen for 3. There is no evidence at all from Earth's long climate history that carbon dioxide has ever determined global temperatures.
The carbon con. We are being sold one of the most blatant lies, at least of modern times, and probably more than that.
You know it well. The sun's radiation comes in the form of light waves, and that heats up the Earth, and then some of the radiation that is absorbed and warms the Earth is re-radiated back into space in the form of infrared radiation. And some of the outgoing infrared radiation is trapped by this layer of atmosphere and held inside the atmosphere. And that's a good thing, because it keeps the temperature of the Earth within certain boundaries, keeps it relatively constant and livable. But the problem is this thin layer of atmosphere is being thickened by all of the global warming pollution that's being put up there. And what that does is it thickens this layer of atmosphere. More of the outgoing infrared is trapped. And so the atmosphere heats up worldwide. That's global warming.
The greenhouse effect. Oh, it doesn't let heat out, so the planet warms, and it's the greenhouse gases, and it's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has become the enemy, the villain. Without carbon dioxide, first of all, in the greenhouse effect, the planet would be too cold for any life, and nothing would bloody grow without carbon dioxide, and we've turned it into the great bloody evil. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in relationship to other greenhouse gases is fractional, and the amount produced by human technology is a tiny, tiny fraction of that fraction. The idea that it's changing the climate of the planet is insane.
You take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
About, isn't it? CO2. CO2 now occupies, get this, 1/10,000th more of the atmosphere than it did in 1750. That is all, 1/10,000th. And if we try really hard and don't cut down our CO2 emissions, we might be able to occupy another 1/2000th part of the atmosphere in the whole of the next 100 years. That is all.
Of the 210 billion metric tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere each year, humans contribute only 6.3 billion tons, or about 3%. Other sources like vegetation, soils, and the ocean dwarf the amount produced by man. The importance of carbon dioxide is diminished even further by the never-mentioned fact that the overwhelming majority of all greenhouse gases is water vapor and clouds, Water vapor comprises approximately 97% of all greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide comprises less than 2%, and the balance is made up of methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide. Many proponents of man-caused global warming claim that water vapor is highly variable across the Earth and from season to season, and therefore is unimportant. Additionally, they claim that CO2 has far greater potential as a greenhouse gas than a small amount would otherwise indicate. While there is some truth in these claims, water vapor remains the dominant greenhouse gas. The effectiveness or potential of greenhouse gases is highly variable due to a host of reasons. At any one time, water vapor accounts for 36 to 70% of the total greenhouse gas effects. If clouds are included, it jumps to 66 to 86%. Carbon dioxide comes in a distant third by accounting for only 9 to 27%. And remember, man's activities accounts for less than 3% of the total carbon dioxide, so at a maximum, man is responsible for less than 1% of all the potential greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
So let's look on now at the history of temperature, then going back 650 million years, 550 million years, back to the Cambrian era, 550 million years ago. Oh yes, I remember it well. And at that time, I remember this, CO2 concentration was 20 times what it is today. So then we have a little experiment for you to do. I want you to squint at this screen now through your lashes. Which bits can you see? The white bits. Those are the clouds. They reflect light back into space. If the planet were to warm, you'd get more clouds and more light reflected back into space, wouldn't you? Yes, you would. So the UN says the opposite would happen, that the Earth would heat up because you'd get more radiation coming down in there. And there is no scientific basis for that conclusion at all.
Elevated levels of carbon dioxide may not be as harmful as Al Gore and other man-caused global warming proponents would have us believe. In fact, there is strong evidence that elevated carbon dioxide may be very beneficial, something that we are never told.
CO2 has been part of the planetary atmosphere since the first day this Earth evolved. And the plants and virtually everything we see evolved in a period of time when the CO2 level was very much higher than it is today. CO2 is something the plants love. They take up CO2, they use it, they give out oxygen. We take the oxygen and give out CO2. So it's hardly a pollutant at all. It's quite a naturally occurring gas that appears in our atmosphere and is very important to sustaining life on this Earth.
In terms of the broad geological perspective, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere right now is low. Almost all the plants that we live with and depend upon for food evolved in an atmosphere when the CO2 was higher in the atmosphere, much higher than it is today, and higher than we could possibly get it even if we tried.
Well, as a matter of fact, there were times when life flourished on Earth. The time when CO2 levels were something like 10 times current levels was when the dinosaurs were running around.
When we've looked at the literature on experiments that have been done with increasing levels of carbon dioxide, what we basically find is that most plants respond the same way. More carbon dioxide gives us more biomass. So if we look at a forest, a rangeland, a marsh, a wetland, or an agricultural field, what's really happening with more CO2 is that you have more plant material produced.
Increased CO2 worldwide, with few exceptions, means plants grow better, period.
We grow vegetables at 2 till 4 times the outside carbon dioxide level.
Okay, research has shown that increases of CO2 concentration of 2, 3, 4, 5 times would not have a detrimental effect upon the Earth's biosphere.
We go up to about 1,500 parts per million. That has no negative effect on human health. To get negative effects on human health, you have to go much higher. That's higher than 5,000 and 10,000 parts per million, at least. Looking at rising levels of CO2 from the viewpoint of the plant, that's no problem at all. We will have a higher production.
The evidence that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to cause a disaster is somewhere between slim and none. However, the evidence that it's doing a good thing by lengthening the growing season and making plants grow better is somewhere between large and overwhelming.
The politicization of this subject started with Margaret Thatcher.
She was very concerned always, I remember when I was Secretary of State for Energy, to promote nuclear power. Long before the issue of climate change came up, because she was concerned about energy security, and she didn't trust the Middle East, and she didn't trust the National Union of Mine Workers. So she didn't trust oil, and she didn't trust coal. So therefore she felt we really had to push ahead with nuclear power. And then when the climate change, global warming thing came up, she felt, well, this is great. This is another argument, because it doesn't have any carbon dioxide emissions. This is another argument why you should go for nuclear. And that is what she was really largely saying. It's been misrepresented since then.
And so she said to the scientists, she went to the Royal Society and she said, there's money on the table for you to prove this stuff. So, of course, they went away and did that.
Inevitably, the moment politicians put their weight behind something and attach their name to it in some ways, of course, money will flow. That's the way it goes. And inevitably, research, development, institutions started to bubble up, if we can put it that way, which were going to be researching climate, but with a particular emphasis on the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature.
At the request of Mrs. Thatcher, the UK Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by two things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
Yet, as the frenzy over man-made global warming grows shriller, many senior climate scientists say the actual scientific basis for the theory is crumbling.
There were periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory.
This morning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made up of...
It is presented in the media as having the stamp of authority of an impressive international organization.
From the IPCC,
the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
The IPCC, like any UN body, is political. The final conclusions are politically driven.
This claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists, you look at the bibliographies of the people and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
The 2,500 IPCC scientists lie. The IPCC, this is the UN's climate panel, it says that 2,500 scientists participated in this dismal report they've just produced in 2007. Al Gore last week in Madison, Wisconsin, inflated that to 4,000. The number of scientists who actually contributed to the crucial chapter of that report, which says that most of the warming of the last 50 years was our fault, was 50. The guy who runs the science panel of the UN's climate panel, is he a climatologist? Nope. Is he a physicist? Nope. Is he a mathematician? Nope. He is a railroad engineer. So we have removed his railroad lines from this graph, and we've added his lordship's much grander purple lines. And you'll see they all run in parallel. And what that means is that the warming rates from 1860 to 1880 and from 1910 to 1940 are exactly the same as the warming rate from 1975 until 1995, when all global warming stopped, and there hasn't been any since. So there is no anthropogenic signal whatsoever in the temperature record, just as the scientists correctly concluded in 1995 before the IPCC, the UN's climate panel, rewrote their paper. Now some lies from the UN's climate panel itself, because it's all very well poking fun at Al Gore, but he's now, frankly, just a bit of a joke. But now we get on to the serious business. This is the body which is supposed to be representing the true facts about the science to the world. But of course, it's not. It's just another vested interest lobby group. The first thing they did was, in 1995, Ken Overpeck talked to David Deming, a scientist who's expert in reconstructing past temperatures, who'd had a paper successfully published in Science for the first time. Overpeck congratulated him. Deming told the story 10 years later. And he said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Now, Overpeck is one of the UN's scientists. We have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Not we have to check whether there was one, check how big it was, check where it happened and where it didn't. No, we have to get rid of it. And here is how they did it. There you will see the 1990 UN report's graph. I've colorized it a bit. I've spelt medieval correctly, but otherwise I've left it alone. And you will see the medieval warm period up there on the left, a kind of camel's hump. It's very clear. You can see the little ice age in the middle there, and then a tiny little pimple on the right, which is today's temperatures. Not exactly an exciting picture. But they were quite honest in the 1990 report. There was the medieval warm period. But then, 1995, Overpeck comes along and says, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Here is what they did by 2001. Same graph, but this time, no medieval bump. And look what has happened to temperature in the 20th century. A huge surge. How have they done that? Notice the small words northern hemisphere temperatures. They left out the southern hemisphere because if they had, they wouldn't have been able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century, as they've done on this graph. So the double lie in this graph. One, no medieval warm period when everybody knows it exists and the science is clear on that. Two, they were able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century. Here's how they did it. First of all, they said, right, we're going to use what are called proxy data sets. These are things like tree rings and sediments from lakes, and we're going to analyze them and see whether the width of the tree rings vary and so forth. We reconstruct temperatures before instruments were available to measure them. And what they did was every time they found a data set that gave them a hockey stick-shaped curve with a nice flat shank going back 1,000 years and then a huge uptick in the 20th century, they said to themselves, we'll give that 390 times as much weighting as we will give to those data sets which show the inconvenient truth that there wasn't this huge surge in the 20th century like the one at the bottom there. Both of those, incidentally, are tree ring data. 390 times as much weighting for the one that suited them as for the one that didn't. That was the first thing they did. Then they used an algorithm for processing all these data sets, a computer program for plotting the graph, which would draw hockey stick-shaped graphs even if you put random red noise into it. That's a kind of random data. Not even the real data, just random data, it would always produce that convenient shape for them which abolished the medieval warm period and exaggerated the warming of the 20th century. But that wasn't enough. Even when they tried both those techniques, the trouble was the medieval warm period kept on still showing up. So then what they did was, if you look at the faint line there, you can see that's what their data would have showed. They tried to remove the actual data for the medieval warm period from certain key data sets. They replaced it with estimates of their own that removed that inconvenient medieval warm period, and they didn't say in the paper that they published in Nature that that was what they'd done. Instead, they said they'd used the actual proxy data. So they actually lied in print.
This guy, James Hansen, who's a close associate of Al Gore, from NASA, he has been exposed for making up temperature changes to make them seem higher than they are by changing the months around to make 1 month seem to be really warm when it shouldn't be, when it was taken from a month which was just a normal temperature. And this is what one of his colleagues says, like he's a close associate of Al Gore, one of his colleagues at NASA. Hansen was never muzzled even though he violated NASA's official agency position on climate forecasting, i.e. we didn't know enough to forecast climate change or mankind's effect on it. Hansen thus embarrassed NASA by coming out with his claims of global warming in 1988 in his testimony before Congress. Nothing happened because he was supposed to do that. And this guy from NASA, John Theon, also goes on about Gore. Gore faces a much different scientific climate in 2009 than the one he faced in 2006 when his film An Inconvenient Truth was released. According to satellite data, the Earth has cooled since Gore's film was released. Antarctic sea ice extent has grown to record levels. Sea level rise has slowed. Ocean temperatures have failed to warm, and more scientists have publicly declared their dissent from man-made climate fears as peer-reviewed studies continue to man-made counter warming fears. This very week, this world expert in sea level rise has said, despite fluctuations down as well as up, the sea is not rising. It hasn't risen in 50 years. And quite apart from examining the hard evidence, the elementary laws of physics, latent heat needed to melt ice, tells us that the apocalypse conjured up by Al Gore and company couldn't possibly come about. And this is interesting too. He said this, the same man. When asked to act as an expert reviewer on the International Panel of Climate Change's last two reports, he was astonished to find that not one of their 22 contributing authors on sea levels was a sea level specialist, not one. Yet the results of all this deliberate ignorance, absolutely, and reliance on rigged computer models have become the most powerful single driver of the entire warmist hysteria.
So we move on then to the consensus lie. You are told time and again, aren't you, that unless we do something drastic about the climate, then there will be disasters, plagues, boils, pustules, frogs, toads, something out of one of the Psalms. That's what you hear. The scientists are all agreed. Al Gore said it again last week. No scientist, he says, disagrees with me. So I checked. I'm boring that way. I keep checking things. That's what scientists do. That's what Al Haytham said we should do. I check them. So I got a colleague who had access to the ISI Web of Science database, a very distinguished scientist, called Klaus Martin Schulte in London, to search all papers published between the beginning of 2004 and the beginning of 2007, using the search term global climate change. 539 papers were identified on that subject. It's a good way of choosing papers randomly. He read them all. And here is the number of papers offering evidence, any evidence at all, of any catastrophe arising from any anthropogenic effect on any part of the climate anywhere in the world. Yep, 0. That's the consensus. Now we come on to a lie in the 1995 report, and this is one of the most extraordinary lies of the lot. Time and again, the scientists in that report said we cannot find any anthropogenic or human signal in the climate record. We are having no effect on temperature as far as we can see. They said it 5 times very clearly. Here's one sample of it, here's another. And now watch this. Here is what the bureaucrats did. They rewrote the final draft, yet again, after it had been cleared and signed off by the scientists, to say the exact opposite. The body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on climate. And that has been the official line ever since.
In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, Professor Frederick Seitz, former president of America's National Academy of Sciences, revealed that IPCC officials had censored the comments of scientists. He said that
this report is not the version that was approved by the contributing scientists.
At least 15 key sections of the science chapter had been deleted. These included statements like,
none of the studies cited has shown clear evidence that we can attribute climate changes to increases in greenhouse gases. No study to date has positively attributed all or part of the observed climate changes to man-made causes.
Professor Seitz concluded,
I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report.
In its reply, the IPCC did not deny making these deletions, but it said there was no dishonesty or bias in the report and that uncertainties about the cause of global warming had been included. The changes had been made, it said, in response to comments from governments, individual scientists, and non-governmental organizations.
When I resigned from the IPCC, I thought that was the end of it. But when I saw the final draft, my name was still there, so I asked for it to be removed. Well, they told me that I had contributed, so it would remain there. So I said, no, I haven't contributed, because they haven't listened to anything I've said. So in the end, it was quite a battle. But finally, I threatened legal action against them, and they removed my name. And I think this happens a great deal. Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
We hear constantly in the media, we hear on a variety of different formats, in the news media as well as on specials. And so, Al Gore's just produced his video, The Inconvenient Truth. He reaffirms time and time and time again in that video that there is no longer any debate. It's a settled science. Well, folks, it's not a settled science by any stretch of the imagination.
All models assume that man-made CO2 is the main cause of climate change, rather than the sun or the clouds.
The analogy I use is like my car's not running very well, so I'm going to ignore the engine, which is the sun, and I'm going to ignore the transmission, which is the water vapor, and I'm going to look at one nut on the right rear wheel, which is the human-produced CO2. It's that, the science is that bad.
The common belief that carbon dioxide is driving climate change is at odds with much of the available scientific data. Data from weather balloons and satellites, from ice core surveys, and from the historical temperature records. But if CO2 isn't driving climate, what is?
Isn't it bizarre to think that it's humans, you know, when we're filling up our car, turning on our lights, that we are the ones controlling climate? Just look in the sky. Look at that massive thing, the sun. Even humans at our present 6.5 billion are minute relative to that.
In the late 1980s, solar physicist Piers Corbyn decided to try a radically new way of forecasting the weather. Despite the huge resources of the official Met Office, Corbyn's new technique consistently produced more accurate results. He was hailed in the national press as a super weatherman. The secret of his success was the sun.
The origin of our solar weather technique of long-range forecasting came originally from study of sunspots and a desire to predict those. And then I realised it was actually much more interesting to use the sun to predict the weather.
Sunspots, we now know, are intense magnetic fields which appear at times of higher solar activity. But for many hundreds of years, long before this was properly understood, astronomers around the world used to count the number of sunspots in the belief that more spots heralded warmer weather. In 1893, the British astronomer Edward Maunder observed that during the Little Ice Age, there were barely any spots visible on the Sun, a period of solar inactivity which became known as the Maunder Minimum.
Do you know sometimes when I go outside and it's cloudy and the clouds move and the sun comes out, it gets warmer. Have you noticed that? I think the sun and warmth have some connection. I feel it in my water. The sun sends out sunspots in cycles, a lot and then less, and now virtually none in the recent end of the cycle. And some of them are as big as Jupiter, and most are bigger than the Earth. They're massive. And they shoot out this solar radiation that comes to the Earth, and it's warm and it's less warm depending on the cycles of the sun. They're just incredible, and they do it in cycles, like I say. And the more sunspot cycles, sunspots that are produced, the more solar radiation stands back in amazement, the warmer that cycle is. And as it goes down into the lower part of the cycle, the temperature starts to fall. That's what has been happening throughout history, and that's what's happening now. Now, there may be other things going on in the sun. I think there probably are at the time as well, but they have nothing to do with what comes out of your exhaust pipe. In the period, of course, temperatures have been falling year on year now, as one scientist said, how many years has temperature got to fall before we realize there's no global warming? It's a scam. They're not interested in the truth. But when it was the temperatures were going up a little bit, it was pointed out quite rightly that temperatures were going up on other planets and moons of the solar system as well. I mean, you know, what was causing that? You know, turbocharged handcarts maybe. And when David de Rothschild appeared from his handbook on the Alex Jones show, he was asked about this, and he said, "My friend, it's because..." He was asked about Saturn and Mars and warming as well, and he said, "Because, my friend, those planets are closer to the sun." Huh? That's what you're dealing with. So, if you go back 1,000 years, 800 years, we went through what was called the medieval warm period, when temperatures were significantly higher than they are today, okay? So there's the turbocharged handcarts that were causing them. Those 4x4 bloody handcarts, what were they doing? And then, after the medieval warm period, we went into what scientists call the Little Ice Age. And a lot of the, people say, it's the warmest year since records begun. And you say, when did records begin? 1864? That's 10 seconds ago in climate cycles on the Earth. And what they've done is picked it up as we were coming out of the Little Ice Age, and then comparing that temperature with now and saying, ooh, look at the gap. During the Little Ice Age, it was so cold, the Thames froze over, and they used to have ice fairs on the Thames every year. And here we go. This is from the Little Ice Age up to what? After the 1950s. The green line is sunspot activity. The red line is Earth temperature. As Al Gore would say in his documentary, I think there's some connection. Then we pick it up from 1860 up to the present day, and again, the green is sunspot activity, and the red is Earth temperature. Now, if you look at it, from 1940 to about 1975, temperatures were falling to such an extent that the BBC was doing documentaries on the dangers of a coming ice age. And after the 1940s, sunspot activity dropped in relation to that, and then started picking up, and so did Earth temperature.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponty publishing books called The Cooling, and the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
Human production of CO2 is not the cause of the warming.
So what do you think is causing global warming?
The sun. There's absolutely no question. The sun is virtually ignored by the authorities, and particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations organization, that are pushing human causes of climate change and CO2.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for 4 decades until the 1970s, and then rose again after that.
When we saw this correlation between the temperature and solar activity or sunspot cycle lengths, then people said to us, okay, it can be just a coincidence. So how can we prove that it's not just a coincidence? Well, one obvious thing is to have a longer time series or different time series. Then we went back in time.
So Professor Friis Christiansen and his colleagues examined 400 years of astronomical records to compare sunspot activity against temperature variation. Once again, they found that variations in solar activity were intimately linked to temperature variation on Earth. It was the sun, it seemed, not carbon dioxide or anything else, that was driving changes in the climate. In a way, it's not surprising. The sun affects us directly, of course, when it sends down its heat. But we now know the sun also affects us indirectly through clouds.
Leave nature alone. Haven't we done?
Geologist Professor Jan Weitzer, going back 600 million years. What they found was that when cosmic rays went up, the temperature went down. When cosmic rays went down, the temperature went up. Clouds and the Earth's climate were very closely linked. To see how close, you just flip the lines.
We just compared the graphs, just put them one upon the other, and it was just amazing. Jan Weitzer looked at me and says, you know, we have very explosive data here.
I've never seen such vastly different records coming together so beautifully to show really what was happening over that long period of time.
The climate was controlled by the clouds. The clouds were controlled by cosmic rays. And the cosmic rays were controlled by the sun. It all came down to the sun.
If you had X-ray eyes, what appears as a nice, friendly yellow ball would appear like a raging tiger. The sun is an incredibly violent beast, and it's throwing out great explosions and puffs of gas, an endless solar wind that's forever rushing past the Earth. We're, in a certain sense, inside the atmosphere of the sun. The intensity of its magnetic field more than doubled during the 20th century.
In 2005, astrophysicists from Harvard University published the following graph in the official journal of the American Geophysical Union. The blue line represents temperature change in the Arctic over the past 100 years. And here is the rise in carbon dioxide over the same period. The two are not obviously connected. But now look again at the temperature record, and at this red line, which depicts variations in solar activity over the past century as recorded independently by scientists from NASA and America's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Solar activity over the last 100 years, over the last several hundred years, correlates very nicely on a decadal basis with sea ice and Arctic temperatures.
To the Harvard astrophysicists and many other scientists, the conclusion is inescapable.
The sun is driving climate change. CO2 is irrelevant.
You know, computers have a common kind of theme all over the world. Shite in, shite out. That's what computer models are, right? If you put rubbish data in, you're going to get ridiculous data out, and that's what these climate models are.
Now we come on to the science, because I'm going to bring this shortly to a close. We want to know the science now, where it actually stands, because the UN's reports, all four of them, even if they were true, and you've seen how often they've lied, and therefore you suspect, rightly, that they're not going to be true, even if they were true, they are now entirely out of date. First of all, they base their research on computer models. And I'm going to explain to you, because it's worth understanding this, why models must fail. They fail because, mathematically speaking, the climate is a chaotic object. And that's not just a term of abuse. It has a specific mathematical meaning, which I'm now going to explain. If you don't know the initial values of the parameters that define the climate object, and there are millions of them, to an extremely high precision, then you cannot make very reliable, very long-term predictions of the climate. What does very long-term mean? It means more than a few weeks. It just goes askew. And I'm going to show why. Here is a seriously simple chaotic equation. F of z equals z squared, or rather maps to z squared plus c, a complex number. This is an iterative equation. It goes round and round to see whether you get a bailout or you don't. Now that's not that kind of bailout. And mind you, Obama could use this equation. It might help. But what you've got here, I've specified that the values of c to 16 decimal places, both in the real and the imaginary part of the complex number c. And I'm going to plot these bailouts on a picture the same size as that slide. Now you would think, simple equation, maybe we get a simple output like this. But the trouble with chaotic equations is that they don't give you simple outputs, because you get bifurcations, or phase transitions as they used to be called. And so just watch the screen now. This is what that really simple equation produces. Now that's not a drawing by me, it's not a work of art. That is in the mathematics of that equation. That's what comes out when you put those numbers in. You can do it at home on a simple computer, it's not a difficult program to run. And that's the picture you will get. And you can see the sheer complexity. And that's an equation with just one parameter. Now imagine millions of parameters, which is what the climate has. No way a computer model can ever reliably predict the climate. So the computer models cannot tell us the answer to this one question we need to know.
People have to understand that the entire global climate change hysteria is driven by computer models. It is not driven by reality. Reality is not warming up like those models said it would.
There is not a computer in the world with the capacity to handle the data but more important to handle all of the calculations of interaction and complexities of the climate.
We frequently hear that the incidence and severity of extreme weather, such things as hurricanes, blizzards, droughts, and floods, are increasing, and that global warming is the cause.
The argument is that we're going to have an increase of drought, and it's another part of the scare tactics. Well, more severe weather, more droughts, and so on. When you look at the long-term record, what you see is that droughts are cyclical. They do alternate, but you also see there are far worse droughts in the past than we've had in the modern record.
By the 1990s, tens of billions of dollars of government funding in the US, UK and elsewhere were being diverted into research relating to global warming. A large portion of those funds went into building computer models to forecast what the climate will be in the future. But how accurate are those models? Dr. Roy Spencer was Senior Scientist for Climate Studies at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He has been awarded medals for exceptional scientific achievement from both NASA and the American Meteorological Society.
Climate models are only as good as the assumptions that go into them, and they have hundreds of assumptions. All it takes is one assumption to be wrong for the forecast to be way off.
If you haven't understood the climate system, if you haven't understood all the components, the cosmic rays, the solar, the CO2, the water vapor, the clouds, and put it all together, if you haven't got all that, then your model isn't worth anything.
The range of climate forecasts varies greatly. These variations are produced by subtly altering the assumptions upon which the models are based.
The models are so complicated, you can often adjust them in such a way that they do something very exciting.
I've worked with modelers, I've done modeling, and with a mathematical model and you tweak parameters, you can model anything. You can make it warmer, you can make it get colder by changing things.
Since all the models assume that man-made CO2 causes warming, one obvious way to produce a more impressive forecast is to increase the amount of imagined man-made CO2 going into the atmosphere.
We put an increase in carbon dioxide in them that is 1% per year. It's been 0.49% per year for the last 10 years, 0.42 for the 10 years before that, and 0.43 for the 10 years before that. So the models have twice as much greenhouse warming radiation going in them as is known to be happening. It shouldn't shock you that they predict more warming than is occurring.
Leave nature alone. Haven't we done enough? We're so self-important. So self-important. Everybody's going to save something now. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. What? Are these fucking people kidding me? Save the planet? We don't even know how to take care of ourselves yet. We haven't learned how to care for one another. We're going to save the fucking planet?
Give often wild speculation about the climate the appearance of rigorous science. They also provide an endless source of spectacular stories for the media.
The thing that has amazed me as a lifelong journalist is how the most elementary principles of journalism seem to have been abandoned on this subject.
In fact, the theory of man-made global warming has spawned an entirely new branch of journalism.
You've got a whole new generation of reporters, environmental journalists. Now, if you're an environmental journalist, and if the global warming story goes in the trash can, so does your job. It really is that crude. And the reporting has to get more and more hysterical because there are still, fortunately, a few hardened news editors around who will say, you know, this is what you were saying 5 years ago. Ah, but now it's much, much worse. You know, there's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise by next Tuesday or something. They have to keep on getting shriller and shriller and shriller.
Early 1990s, I led a multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of global warming on our nation's ecosystems. And what you'll find is about that time is that the government would begin to fund tremendously global warming research. It was about $2 billion a year then. It's up to $4 billion a year now. There's a whole cadre of scientists out there that are on what's called soft money. If they do not show a global warming connection, they will not get their next grant. And it's been shown time and time again when a scientist basically says, I cannot take this any longer, it's just not happening, they no longer get grants from the federal government. And they're out of a job.
Climate scientists need there to be a problem in order to get funding.
We have a vested interest in creating panic because then money will flow to climate science.
There's one thing you shouldn't say, and that is, this might not be a problem.
It is the story of how a political campaign turned into a bureaucratic bandwagon.
Fact of the matter is that tens of thousands of jobs depend upon global warming right now. It's a big business.
It's become a great industry in itself. And if the whole global warming farrago collapsed, there'd be an awful lot of people out of jobs and looking for work.
I think the level of funding for climate and climate-related sciences was somewhere around the order of $170 million a year, which was reasonable for the size of the field. It jumped to $2 billion a year, more than a factor of 10. And yeah, that changed a lot. I mean,
that's a lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs. It brought a lot of new people into it who otherwise were not interested. So you developed whole cadres of people whose only interest in the field was that there was global warming.
If I wanted to do research on, shall we say, the squirrels of Sussex, what I would do, and this is any time from 1990 onwards, I would write my grant application saying, I want to investigate the nut-gathering behavior of squirrels with special reference to the effects of global warming. And that way I get my money. If I forget to mention global warming, I might not get the money.
There's really no question in my mind that the large amounts of money that have been fed into this particular, rather small area of science have distorted the overall scientific effort.
We're all competing for funds. And if your field is the focus of concern, you have that much less work rationalizing why your field should be funded.
Scientists, accustomed to the relative civility and obscurity of academic life, suddenly find themselves publicly attacked if they dare to challenge the theory of man-made global warming, vilified by campaign groups and even within their own universities.
It's the old English saying, if you stand up in the coconut shy, they're going to throw at you. So I understand that there's going to be some of that, but it gets pretty difficult and pretty nasty and very personal. And there've been, you know, death threats and all sorts of things. And so I'm not doing it for my health.
These days, if you are skeptical about the litany around climate change, you're suddenly like as if you're a Holocaust denier.
Research relating to man-made global warming is now one of the best funded areas of science. The US government alone spends more than $4 billion a year. According to NASA climatologist Roy Spencer, scientists who speak out against man-made global warming have a lot to lose.
It's generally harder to get research proposals funded because of the stands that we've taken publicly. And you'll find very few of us that are willing to take a public stand because it does cut into their research funding.
I think it's a global con game that Al Gore has initiated, and I'm sure he's used, he's probably in cahoots with George Soros and a lot of those people with the power and the money, and it's made him, probably a billionaire by now. And thing is, but a billion's not enough. Once they get a little, they want a lot, and then they want it all, and that's what Al Gore, George Soros, Barack Obama, that's what they want. They want total control over the world.
It is now common in the media to lay the blame for every storm or hurricane on global warming. But is there any scientific basis for this?
This is purely propaganda. Every textbook in meteorology is telling you the main source of weather disturbances is the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole. And we're told in a warmer world, this difference will get less. Now that would tell you you'll have less storminess, you'll have less variability. But for some reason that isn't considered catastrophic. So you're told the opposite.
News reports frequently argue that even a mild increase in global temperature could lead to a catastrophic melting of the polar ice caps. But what does Earth's climate history tell us?
We happen to have temperature records of Greenland that go back thousands of years. Greenland has been much warmer. Just 1,000 years ago, Greenland was warmer than it is today, yet it didn't have a dramatic melting event.
Even if we talk about something like permafrost, a great deal of the permafrost, that icy layer under the forests of Russia, for example, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago melted far more than we're having any evidence about it melting now. So in other words, this is a historical pattern again, but the world didn't come to a crunching halt because of it.
Professor Siunishi Akasofu is head of the International Arctic Research Center in Alaska. The IARC is the world's leading Arctic research institute. Professor Akasofu insists that over time, the ice caps are always naturally expanding and contracting.
There are reports from time to time a big chunk of ice break away from the Antarctic continent. Those must have been happening all the time. But because now we have a satellite that can detect those, that's why they become the news.
This data from NASA's meteorological satellites shows the huge natural expansion and contraction of the polar sea ice taking place in the 1990s.
Practically all the TV programs that relate to global warming show big chunk of ice falling from the edge of the glaciers, but people forget that ice is always moving.
News reports frequently show images of ice breaking from the edge of the Arctic. What they don't say is that this is as ordinary an event in the Arctic as falling leaves on an English autumn day.
They ask me, did you see ice falling from the edge of the glaciers? Yes. That's the spring breakup. That's happened every year. Press come to us all the time, I want to see something that the greenhouse disaster. I say there's none.
Alarming television programs raise the fearful prospect of vast tidal waves flooding Britain. But what causes the sea level to change, and how fast does it happen?
Sea level changes over the world in general are governed fundamentally by two factors. What we would call local factors, the relationship of the sea to the land, which often, by the way, is to do with the land rising or falling than anything to do with the sea. But if you're talking about what we call eustatic changes of sea, worldwide changes of sea, that's through the thermal expansion of the oceans, nothing to do with melting ice. And that's an enormously slow and long process.
People say, oh, I see the ocean doing this last year. That means that something changed in the atmosphere last year. And this is not necessarily true at all. In fact, it's actually quite unlikely, because it can take hundreds to thousands of years for the deep ocean to respond to forces and changes that are taking place at the surface.
Well, what about the Antarctic and Greenland? Won't their melting cause massive shoreline flooding?
It's considered relatively more stable, however, than another big body of ice that's roughly the same size. Greenland would also raise sea level almost 20 feet if it went. If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. This is what would happen to San Francisco Bay. A lot of people live in these areas.
Even the highly political United Nations IPCC states in their 2007 summary for policymakers that the most that will happen by the 21st century is 59 centimeters or 23 inches. The only possible reason that Al Gore would use such a blatant distortion of truth would be to create a sense of raw fear in the video's viewers. Tragically, the inconvenient truth has been repeatedly shown to thousands of naive elementary and high school students who have little to no basis to judge the merits of what they're watching. Not only is Al Gore's assessment extremely exaggerated, but there is compelling evidence that many parts of Antarctica are getting colder, and the center of Greenland's ice cap is actually growing, not melting. The evidence for Greenland is quite dramatic. On July 15, 1942, 2 B-17 flying fortresses and 6 P-38 Lightnings flying from the United States to England were forced to make an emergency landing on Greenland's southern ice cap. The crew was rescued, but the planes were left on the ice. In 1988, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor led a team to find these missing planes. They expected to find them within 40 feet of the surface. They did not. After several years of failure, the planes were finally found in 1992. 1 mile from the landing site and 268 feet below the ice surface. The team used hot water to dig a tunnel down to one of the planes to extract it. Dubbed the Glacier Girl, the plane was restored and is now flying again. The planes did not sink to a depth of 268 feet, nor did the glacier push them down to that depth. If that were the case, the planes would have been ripped apart. Rather, 268 feet of ice accumulated on them from 1941 to 1992. Although the results are complex, other research shows that much of Greenland's interior ice cap is growing, and only its edges are melting. In balance, there is only a slight decline for the entire continent. Al Gore ignores all this and concentrates instead on the melting that is occurring on the edges of Greenland.
10 years later, this is what happened. And here's the melting from 2005.
Should we be alarmed about this melting? 800 years ago, the Earth was considerably warmer than it is today. The Vikings settled in southern Greenland and prospered in an agrarian culture. That period is known as the medieval optimal or medieval warm period, and the Vikings grew crops where much of the melting is occurring today. By 1400, when the temperature was about what it is today, the climate had become so cold that the Vikings had to abandon many of their settlements. If these same Vikings were here today, they would undoubtedly tell us that this warming is not such a bad thing.
Here, for instance, is the sea level La, where what Al Gore says is, he says, right, the melting ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland are going to raise sea level by 20 feet imminently. Now, in fact, the other side tried to say he didn't mean imminently, but we said, yes, he did. Look at the way he's showing the sea wiping out Manhattan and San Francisco and Bangladesh, and the whole of Holland would disappear. It's wonderfully it took very expensive graphics to do that. These maps showing the disappearance of the land bit by bit as the sea level inexorably rose by 20 feet, wiping out existing populations. But actually, even the UN's normally excitable climate panel says that those ice sheets will only contribute 2 inches to sea level rise over the whole of the next 100 years. That's what the science says. But this is what the judge said. The Armageddon scenario that he depicts is not based on any scientific view. And the judge, of course, was quite right. And Gore knew the judge was right, because in the year he made that movie, he spent $4 million buying, yes, some of you have got there already, buying a condo in the St. Regis Tower, San Francisco, just feet from the ocean at Fisherman's Wharf. So how many of you think that as he went in through 20 feet of sea level rise through the doors of that building, he would not find himself going glug, glug, glug? I mean, it is monstrous that a man who does this, who knows perfectly well that sea level is only going to rise by around 8 inches to 16 inches in the whole of the next century, depending on whether you believe Professor Nicholas Murner, who's written 520 papers on the subject, or the UN, who says the 16 inches. That's all it's going to be. It's actually not risen at all in the last 4 years, as we'll see later. Throughout the period of measurement, which is 6 years, the oceans have been cooling. The heat energy is not accumulating there. And as a result, sea level over the last 4 years, that little red arrow at the top there, is hardly increasing at all. It was increasing at a dizzying rate of 1 foot per century. Now, not at all. Not what you see reported in the newspapers.
You ought to stop fishing in the ice like that. The size of that hole is causing climate change.
Really? How do you figure that out?
Well, you've been fishing like that for as long as I can remember, and climate change is happening, so that must be causing it. Haven't you seen all the pollution in the air?
No, that's not causing climate change. Climate change is caused by fishing with synthetic lines like that one you've got.
No, I don't think that's it. I think it's your position. See, you're facing east. You need to not be facing east.
Not be facing east? That sounds a bit far-fetched. I think it's the blue hat you're wearing that's causing climate change.
My blue hat?
Yeah, it's clear.
Do you think so?
Yeah, well, maybe not, but what else could possibly be causing climate change?
Maybe it's the humans.
The humans?
Yeah.
No. Do you think for one moment that they would allow that to happen to us?
Oh, it's got to be the hats then.
Yeah, it must be the hats.
Man-caused global warming proponents also claim that because the North Pole is melting, polar bears are threatened with extinction. However, numerous studies have shown that all but one of the many polar bear populations are stable or increasing. Polar bears have managed to survive just fine through many other periods in the past 10,000 years in which it was much warmer than even the most pessimistic global warming predictions today.
Now this one is the earliest instrumental temperature record we have, the Central England temperature record. And it shows, between the arrows there, that between 1700 and 1735, a third of a century, temperatures rose in central England by 4 degrees Fahrenheit. They managed just about 1 degree Fahrenheit in the whole of the 20th century. And the significance of 1700 to 1735 is that that was before the Industrial Revolution began. We could have had nothing whatever to do with that temperature increase. And it is 9 times as fast a rate of increase as we have seen in the whole of the 20th century. So when they tell you the rate of increase in temperature is something wholly new, you look at that graph and it's absolute rubbish. Then there's the polar bears lie. where he quotes a scientific paper saying that polar bears are dying all over the shop because of global warming. Here is the actual paper that he was quoting from, Monnet and Gleason, 2006, 4 dead polar bears. And why did they die? Nothing about global warming in the entire paper. What the paper said was that there had been high winds and high waves in a bad storm. In the technical language that we climatologists like to use, shit happens. So I checked, and the Beaufort Sea, where these 4 polar bears died, has shown, if anything, a slight increase in the amount of sea ice available over the last 30 or 40 years. So there's no basis whatsoever for his suggestion that the polar bears were having to swim up to 60 miles to find ice. The whole story was a fiction, and as the film you've just heard said, the population of polar bears has increased dramatically since the 1940s or 1950s, somewhere between 2 and 5 times. We don't know exactly, but it's certainly a huge increase in polar bear population, hardly, as you may think, the profile of a species in imminent threat of extinction. And as the movie also said, this is an example of a logical fallacy. In fact, it's one of the Aristotelian canon of logical fallacies. It is the argumentum ad misericordiam. We feel sorrow for the polar bears because they're cuddly, and therefore global warming is terrible. There is no logic in that. It's all emotion. So now just a few lies from the scientific community. Who can guess what kind of a lie I'm illustrating here? Anybody? Yes, it's our old friend, the start point fallacy. They decided they would start this graph just in 1970, the intention being to show that hurricanes are getting far worse because of global warming. And that's what the paper concluded. So I, being dull and boring and scientific, went and got the rest of the hurricane activity record. The hurricane activity is a measure of the frequency, duration, and incidence of hurricanes and typhoons and tropical cyclones all around the equator, added up into a 12-month running sum. It reached its least extent in the last 50 years just a few weeks ago, and none of you will have seen that reported either.
And temperatures have been dropping in recent years because the solar sunspot cycle has been going through a real low point. Have you noticed too, global warming is not the term anymore because temperature's falling. Climate change is the new one. That's the new buzzword now.
So now then we have another possibility that you need to understand. The fact of warming, which of course stopped in 1995 and hasn't really resumed since, but the fact of warming does not tell us its cause. Every time you hear the environmentalists say, oh, it's been melting in Greenland, therefore humankind is responsible for global warming. That is the Aristotelian fallacy known as the argumentum ad ignorantiam. We don't know what's causing the warming, so we're going to blame it on anything we like. That is not a rational or logical argument. And it might just as well be Al Gore with his flamethrower on the surface of Greenland. I produced this graph. I'm sorry that the text is not entirely clear, but what I'm saying here is that there has been global cooling for the last 8 or 9 years. Statistically significant and rapid cooling. How many of you have seen that reported in any major news medium recently?
Good or bad, the temperature stopped increasing, so the projections of disaster have basically been folding.
Now, I was asked before I came here, what about the sun? Now, the sun is that large yellow object in the sky from which all the warmth in the climate actually comes. It is therefore not implausible to assume it may have something to do with things. Here is the record, and it's a very remarkable record, of what has happened to solar activity as measured by sunspot activity over the past 300 or 400 years. You'll notice on the left the Maunder Minimum, when for 70 years the sun was less active than at any time in the past 11,400 years. On the right, you will see the grand maximum from 1925 to 1995, when it was more active than at any time in the last 11,400 years. A remarkable increase in solar activity, corresponding to a really remarkably small increase in global mean surface temperature. But the solar physicists, you might take Scafetta and West, say, in 2008, they attribute 69% of all the recent global warming to the sun. Most solar physicists agree. The International Astronomical Union in 2004 had a symposium on it. They concluded that that was the case. They said we're now going to get global cooling because the sun's turned itself off for a bit. And global cooling is what we've had ever since. They're getting it right, and the UN's getting it wrong.
EU to ban construction of ordinary family homes by 2020. Control of every facet of everyone's life. That is the game plan. The European Union has adopted a regulation that will ban the construction of ordinary family homes starting from 2020. Only the so-called passive homes will be allowed. For example, on page 33 of 71 of the PDF document above says that all new buildings have to be nearly zero energy buildings. See, like Bill Gates said, zero energy. This is total tyranny. You're not allowed to have energy. That's siege. This is high-tech siege. By the end of 2020, it has to be true by the end of 2018 for all new buildings occupied by public authorities. So that's how they fund the industry of this, is government adopts it first. One of the first passive houses in Darmstadt, Germany, and I've heard about this house on NPR. They promote it as it's real cool. The windows are oblique to go to the south. Also, it is not a coincidence that the house is ugly. Ugly and compact houses are more energy efficient. Everything must look the same, too. The government decides what's on TV, what's on radio, what your house looks like, how many kids you can have. Government is God. A passive house is essentially an ugly cube that covers its energy needs by a perpetual motion machine or something that has the same carbon footprint. Also, it's super perfectly isolated so that the CO2 you exhale by breathing will get out of the house. The EU apparatchiks see another advantage in this passive house if you... I mean, it just goes on. And, of course, there'll have to be big houses with a bunch of people living in it because that uses less material. At this moment, there exists 15,000 of passive homes in the world, mostly in Germany, Australia, and Scandinavia. People would realize that the ordinary houses will become scarce, a limited commodity, and their price will jump at least by 10 to 15%. Oh, you don't get to live in a house by yourself. It's an apartment building. However, don't expect that the existing owners will be completely protected against the new insane politics. If they want to sell or rent their house or apartment starting in 2012, they will have to get in a document about the energy efficiency of the real estate, something that costs $500 or so. Well, in a couple of years, those become mandatory. And in the Senate bill that's passed the House, in 1 week, if you don't make the changes they want, your home is forfeited. No court, no nothing. So they're just training you about how cool and how fun all of this is. So that is just total control. This is the enviro cult that has nothing to do with the environment. Are they worried about genetic engineering, cross-species engineering? Are they worried about things that actually could damage the Earth, nuclear weapons, fission fusion? Are they worried about the Hadron superconducting super collider? Are they worried about all these super technologies that do endanger the Earth? No. They're teaching you that carbon that all animals exhale is a toxic waste to make you the enemy. And government then can come in and take control of your life.
But why, if this is so, are we bombarded day after day with news items about man-made global warming? Why do so many people in the media and elsewhere regard it as an undisputed fact? Western governments have now embraced the need for international agreements to restrain industrial production in the developed and developing world. But at what cost? Paul Driesen is a former environmental campaigner.
My big concern with global warming is that the policies being pushed to supposedly prevent global warming are having a disastrous effect on the world's poorest people.
Global warming campaigners say it does no harm to be on the safe side. Even if the theory of man-made climate change is wrong, we should impose draconian measures to cut carbon emissions just in case. They call this the Precautionary Principle.
The Precautionary Principle is a very interesting beast. It's basically used to promote a particular agenda and ideology. It's always used in one direction only. It talks about the risks of using a particular technology, fossil fuels, for example, but never about the risks of not using it. It never talks about the benefits of having that technology.
Because there's just one economic point I will make very briefly, and that is that in order to forestall just 1 Celsius degree or 2 Fahrenheit degrees of global warming, even if the UN is right about the exaggerated effect of CO2 on global warming, which we now know it not to be, even if it's right, you have to forego 2 trillion tons of CO2 emission. Now that's the equivalent of 67 years of the world's entire output of 30 billion tons a year. You have to close down the global economy entirely, go back to the Stone Age without even the right to light a fire in your caves. That's what you'd have to do just to knock off 2 Fahrenheit of global warming, so-called. That's all you need to know about the economics of global warming in one slide. There's no point in doing anything whatsoever about it except to adapt as and if necessary, which we now know we don't even need to do. That's the end of the debate on the economics.
Yes, Senator, it's a global problem and it has to be solved with a global strategy. But this is the rare but all-important global or strategic problem. Its aspect is in the global dimension. And every nation has to be a part of the solution.
So what you're telling me is that there's more to this global warming than what our media and what our government and everything is telling us, and is it about money making?
Very, very much so.
Very much so. But isn't stopping pollution a good idea?
Stopping pollution is a great idea, Governor. This has nothing to do with pollution. That's the myth. This is much more about power and money and control of the population. Everything is so connected to carbon dioxide and the emission of carbon dioxide that everything you do is going to go up in price. This is going to control virtually every industry that you could name. We're talking about energy, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about our very way of life is going to be radically changed, and that's bad.
Why?
This is considered to be the biggest tax increase on man that we've ever seen, and once it's put into the system, we'll never be able to get it back. This is one of the biggest Ponzi schemes we've ever seen.
Okay.
Basically, what that's going to allow is a company like, an oil company. They can go out, they can spread as much carbon dioxide as they want.
And pollute as much as they want.
Pollute as much as they want, but then go out and buy these credits and just say, we're carbon neutral. The net result is going to be the greatest control over mankind that we've ever seen.
So if global warming isn't man-made, why are they telling us it is?
Because they're using it as a vehicle for political control every aspect of people's lives. The number of children you could have, the number of people on the planet, where they can live, what they can drive, everything. If you can control carbon, you can control the planet.
The agendas essentially are raising money, raising taxes, gaining control of people's lives, and the fact that the consumer and the taxpayer will not benefit from it, we'll satisfy them by telling them they're saving the world and that they should get a high from that.
One of the things that most people do not understand is most of the environmental laws that we have created over the last 40 years have come from a very small group of people through what is known as the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This itself has been created and funded and sponsored by principals like Prince Philip or Prince Charles, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation.
Started in 1968. The Club of Rome is there within the network to manipulate the environmental movement to advance this agenda of global centralization.
Sir Maurice Strong, a senior official of the UN. He has long been quite open about his desire to establish a world government, by which he does not mean a democratic government.
Maurice Strong. If Al Gore is the front man for global warming, Maurice Strong is the wizard behind the curtain.
Yes, I know that CO2 tax is considered just wildly unrealistic now, but our pattern of financing our social programs and health and welfare programs on the backs of employment has outlived its rationality and usefulness.
See the payroll tax?
Yeah, sharply reduce or eliminate, absolutely, and replace it with a pollution-based tax system, principally CO2. I fully understand how inaccessible that sounds in this context. I really believe that would help our economy, help our competitiveness, and I think it would put incentives in place to do the right thing.
Regardless of Al Gore's assurances, making everything more expensive because of a carbon tax cannot help our economy or individual families, nor can a cap-and-trade scheme that is also promoted by Gore and other alarmists. The Congressional Budget Office warned that such efforts would be, and I quote, regressive in that poorer households would bear a larger burden relative to their income than the wealthier households would.
They've gone from global warming to climate change. They've gone from climate change to energy security.
But to truly transform our economy,
εδώ και τώρα πρέπει να αλλάξουμε ρότα.
To protect our security and save our planet from the ravages of climate change.
Προτείνουμε να αλλάξουμε αναπτυξιακό πρότυπο και να περάσουμε στην λεγόμενη πράσινη ανάπτυξη.
We need to ultimately make clean, renewable energy the profitable kind of energy.
Που έχει ως επίκεντρο τον άνθρωπο, που επενδύει στην παιδεία, στο περιβάλλον, στις νέες τεχνολογίες, στην καινοτομία.
So I ask this Congress to send me legislation that places a market-based cap on carbon pollution and drives the production of more renewable energy in America.
Μη γελάτε. Μη γελάτε. Δεν τα κατανοείτε. Δεν κατανοείτε την εποχή που έρχεται. Αυτές όμως οι ευλογίες που τόσο απλόχερα μας προσφέρει η φύση απειλούνται. Απειλούνται γιατί η κλιματική αλλαγή είναι γεγονός που βρίσκεται μαζί μας και μπροστά μας. Ο αριθμός παντού στον κόσμο των προσφύγων λόγω της αλλαγής έχει παγκοσμίως διπλασιαστεί. Η κλιματική αλλαγή προκαλεί ακραία καιρικά φαινόμενα. Πλημμύρες, ξηρασία, πυρκαγιές, τα ζούμε, κύματα καυσώνων και όλο με μεγαλύτερη ένταση και μεγαλύτερη συχνότητα. Γι' αυτό πήραμε αυτή την πρωτοβουλία και εγώ προσωπικά μαζί με τον Πρωθυπουργό της Τουρκίας, τον κύριο Ταγίπ Ερντογάν, διότι στη Μεσόγειο, όπως είπε ο Τζέφρι Σάξ, επαληθεύεται το κακό σενάριο ίσως περισσότερο από κάθε άλλο μέρος του κόσμου. Η περιοχή της Μεσογείου, η νοτιοανατολική Μεσόγειος, είναι ιδιαίτερα ευάλωτη στην άνοδο της θερμοκρασίας και έχουμε πραγματικούς κινδύνους μπροστά μας. Δεν αποκλείεται, παραδείγματος χάρη, οι θερμότερες και ξηρότερες κλιματικές συνθήκες να αποδεκατήσουν τη γεωργική παραγωγή που χαρακτηρίζει εδώ και αιώνες την περιοχή μας.
A quote from Newsweek magazine. Now listen to this. This is a quote. It says, "There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically and that these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth." Second, a headline in the New York Times reads, "Climate changes endanger world's food output." Here's another quote from Time magazine. As they review the bizarre and unpredictable weather pattern of the past several years, a growing number of scientists are beginning to suspect that many seemingly contradictory meteorological fluctuations are actually part of a global climate upheaval. All this sounds very ominous. That is until you realize that the three quotes I just read were from articles in 1975, editions of Newsweek magazine and the New York Times, and of Time magazine in 1974. They weren't referring to global warming, they were warning of a coming ice age. So the same people who were hysterical back then are using the same words to describe what's happening today.
Είναι ιστορικής σημασίας αυτές οι αλλαγές για το μέλλον μας. Απειλείται όχι μόνο το κλίμα μας, αλλά ο ίδιος ο πολιτισμός μας, η ζωή μας. Και οι γενιές που έρχονται απειλούνται, αν ζουν εδώ, αν ζουν στην περιοχή, να θυμούνται τη Μεσόγειο μόνο ως ανάμνηση, όπως είναι σήμερα.
So they will lie and cheat, and even when they're caught out, they will continue to lie and cheat.
Και όπως έχουν δείξει οι συνομιλίες στον ΟΗΕ, το να συνεργαζόμαστε, να δουλεύουμε μαζί, αν και τόσο απαραίτητο, φαίνεται ότι είναι και το δυσκολότερο στην παγκόσμια αυτή προσπάθεια διακυβέρνησης που έχουμε. Αλλά αυτή είναι η πρόκληση.
But it is the awareness itself that will drive the change. And one of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance and global agreements.
Ξέρουμε πολύ καλά, η περιοχή μας είναι μια όμορφη περιοχή, αλλά και ποικιλόμορφη, πολιτικά, κοινωνικά και οικονομικά. Όμως μας ενώνει αυτή η απειλή, αυτό το μεγάλο πρόβλημα.
And the idea is to scam us into a state of survival and a state of giving our power away, more and more taxation, more and more international law to dictate to us what we can and cannot do on the basis of saving the planet. New world order to save the earth.
Η χώρα μας το 2012 θα κληθεί να δημοπρατήσει δικαιώματα ρήπων, που η αξία τους εκτιμάται πάνω από 2 δισεκατομμύρια ευρώ. Ναι κύριοι, σε αυτό το σημείο έχουμε φτάσει στον πλανήτη μας. Να αναγκαζόμαστε να δημοπρατούμε δικαιώματα ρήπανσης. Αυτά τα δικαιώματα όμως θα κληθούν να αγοράσουν και να πληρώσουν δηλαδή οι μεγάλοι τομείς της βιομηχανίας μας που ρηπαίνουν, και κυρίως η ηλεκτροπαραγωγή όπως είναι και η ΔΕΗ, τα οποία θα εισπράξει βέβαια το κράτος. Αλλά ουσιαστικά αυτά θα τα πληρώσει, θα κληθεί τελικά να τα πληρώσει ο ίδιος ο καταναλωτής.
There is nothing wrong with the planet. Nothing wrong with the planet. The planet is fine. The people are fucked.
The environment is being used for a power struggle. The environment is being used for centralized government. The environment is being used to make a one-world government.
Treaties are one road to global governance. United Nations conferences are another. These global conferences pretend to be democratic conventions of representatives of more than 100 nations who come together to vote for plans they all agree on. Nothing could be further from the truth. The policies are all written ahead of time, and the so-called delegates are manipulated to produce what is called consensus.
There are essentially 5 major problems with the Global Warming Treaty as it is now being conceived and probably presented. One, there's no clear, concise science. At best, the science is contradictory. It's inconclusive, it's unclear. Second, the economic consequences. The economic consequences, we know for sure, would be disastrous, would be devastating to this country, driving industries out of this country. We would lose millions of jobs, energy costs would go up, productivity would go down, standard of living would go down. Third, if in fact you want to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly don't do that by binding the developed nations and let all the other countries, 130 of the so-called non-developed countries, including China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and others, off. Fourth, national sovereignty. This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, if we signed this treaty, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do, use of what energy, which sources of energy, the costs of energy. And fifth, national security implications. If this treaty was signed, it would have disastrous implications on our national security. It would mean that we would have to fly less, we would shut down many of our training programs for tanks, armored vehicles, for ships, and for what? To sign this treaty.
The Kyoto Protocol, for instance, to supposedly solve the global warming issue will not solve global warming. It has nothing to do with actually reducing the carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. If you know what is actually happening in that, the developing nations, China and Russia and so forth, are not bound by that treaty. They can continue to expand their industry, continue to pollute and so forth forever. And in fact, China is basically going to overtake the emissions of carbon dioxide by the United States within 2 years. And so, no effect on those particular nations. They can continue just to increase. Only the developed nations are required to decrease. We have the issue of having to buy carbon credits from those third world nations. So it's a massive income redistribution plan to provide money for these third world nations, and it will not help global warming whatsoever. Even the United Nations admits this.
The overlords of the New World Order are now aggressively pushing for a worldwide one-child policy. The Chinese one-child policy was phased in gradually. In the 60s, when it began, you only had to pay a tax penalty. Only later did they imprison you if you had more than one child. Now the exact same proposals to penalize couples who have more than one child are being made in the United States, England, and Europe.
In the push to reduce global warming, children, according to some, are the new culprits. A think tank in the UK says too many kids are what's making the planet worse, saying large families, anything over 2 children really, should be frowned upon as an environmental no-no, akin to not reusing your plastic bags, driving one of those big gas-guzzling cars, taking long trips overseas. The UK, in fact, has negative growth. I think Canada does too. That still, families in our rich countries shouldn't have more than 2 kids.
The notion of anthropogenic global warming is a fraud. In other words, the idea that the planet is getting warmer and that human activity is somehow responsible. Global warming caused by human activity, and the answer to that is carbon tax plus cap and trade, according to the wishes of Al Gore, Prince Charles, and basically the entire world banking community, the world oligarchy. What they're trying to do with that is to perpetuate The current system where bankers rule the world, financiers rule the world, and the rest of us get the crumbs from the table.
The Club of Rome has been aggressively pushing a global carbon tax as a way to fund their planetary government. Countries across the world mark the day by passing new carbon tax schemes and raising taxes on gasoline, natural gas, and electricity. The new taxes will be paid directly to the private bank consortium. At the producer level, taxes will be paid on farm animals' flatulence. At the consumer level, there will be carbon taxes on all forms of meat, beef, poultry, pork, and fish. All cars will be fitted with satellite tracking boxes that will tax driving by the mile. And an added tax will be placed on all fossil fuels, including motor oil and natural gas. All plastic products will have a carbon tax added. Outdoor space heaters and fireplaces are to be taxed. All electricity produced by coal-powered plants will be taxed. Under the cap-and-trade system, citizens will be forced to pay taxes on thousands of products to private cap-and-trade services owned by Al Gore and other elitists. There will be taxes on light bulbs, water, trash pickup, air travel, train travel, bus, ship, medicine, steel production, mining, clothing, laundry, asphalt are just a few of the new taxes to be levied.
In the draft copy of the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment, it states very clearly that we must reduce the human population from its current level of about 6 billion people down to about 1 billion people.
They want as much of humanity as possible, it sometimes seems to me, to be wiped off the face of the planet. And there is a better way to control population than to withdraw the one effective agent against one of the world's biggest killers. And that is to raise the standard of living of the poorest.
Somewhere along the line, you changed. You stopped being you. You let people stick a finger in your face and tell you you're no good. And when things got hard, you started looking for something to blame, like a big shadow. Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you. You're better than that. But until you start believing yourself, you're gonna have a life.